So we might just start from the top again with Arj.
He's right.
Yep. So Jackie Fleetwood said, you managed that you may now change your approach to traumatic LPs. How do we implement new research into our everyday practice, and how do we decide when to kick old habits for new?
Yeah, so that's the big challenge, isn't it? So I think, so if I can reflect personally, what I've found challenging, so doing research is challenging, and getting resources for it, and a big shout out to the Predict Network, who've really pushed that in Australia and New Zealand, and tried to get resources, and actually quite magnanimously offering resources to places to try and build capacity. So that's been a really good innovation, but that's been for the 13 paediatric emergency departments. So me personally, I'm trying to build a bit of a research team in the emergency department I work in, and try and identify what are the gains that we can get in terms of what are the big things that we need to do research on. The challenge is the low, so we're talking about LP in particular, the challenge with that study was low numbers, and that's always going to be the challenge in any study of a low prevalence disease, and being able to pick whether something is meaningful or not in a low prevalence disease. I think that's the challenge we have in paediatrics.
At the moment I'm chairing PARUCI, which is the UK equivalent. One of the challenges I've given to us is we're a research organisation, we believe in best evidence, so are we going to practice what we preach? And can sites be PARUCI sites if you're not following the best practice? What the advantage is, how many people here who deal in ED and treat buckle fractures put them in a plaster of Paris still? Anyone using plaster of Paris for buckle splints? That's excellent to see. There are still centres in the UK doing that. And so that means that actually that translation hasn't occurred at all.
I guess the other thing I'd add to that, and I know Stuart's in the room, so I think Predict, we talked about the bronchiolitis guideline yesterday, and that was an example of, I think, Predict trying to do some knowledge translation around research, but that was a big undertaking, producing a really thoroughly evidence-based guideline for the most common thing we see, one of the most common things we see in paediatric emergency. Producing an evidence-based guideline to standardise practice was just a huge undertaking. I'm sure Stuart he's nodding his head over there.
He's got his thumb up. I might just extend that question over to Susie, because you got a toy car in your department based on some research. How did that process happen?
I guess it was fortunate timing where there's a local fundraising group in our area called the Illawarra Community Foundation, and around the time that Tanya, the anaesthetist, had seen the article, there was a funding round so that they, a call for funding applications. So if you need a piece of equipment, you can put in an application. And we thought, what the heck, why not? So it was fortunate timing, really. We're very fortunate to have a very active fundraising group in our district who are very passionate about children. And we are busy trying to partner with them and work with them to redevelop our ward and develop better facilities. So this absolutely ticked their box, because the big annual fundraising event they run is called Convoy, and basically all the truck drivers in the district line up in Appin, and then they drive with the motorcycles leading the way. And I rode my scooter in Convoy last year. The way down Mount Ousley into Wollongong to a sort of party fun day at the end of the day, and the community vie fiercely for the privilege of being the lead truck or the lead motorcycle, and they spend the whole year fundraising for their bid to be the lead truck. And they raise lots of dollars. They raised nearly $2 million last year. So we were fortunate. Having said that, I think the cars only cost, they were less than $1,000 each, so $895. Which for the Convoy group was a no-brainer. They were very happy to fund them.
That's fantastic. It's great to see such great community engagement. And I might also throw that open to you, Kylie, in terms of, there's been a lot of interest on Twitter about the huddle. How have you been involved in your own workplace in terms of huddle? How have you seen other people implement the huddle in their workplaces?
So we went ahead 2.5 years ago now, I think, progressing it, and we developed our own script, and we used identifying features similar to the Watcher model, And obviously the context in ED is a little bit different to the rest of the hospital. So for outliers for us were admitted patients. So in emergency, we only expect to give you 1 dose of antibiotic. We don't expect to give you your second one or give you lunch, dinner, breakfast. We don't expect to have to support the family in meals, all those kinds of things. So we will forget about you the longer you stay in emergency, and that's just because you become not part of the core business. So that's just one example of how we localised it. We held it in the morning because that was a good time to identify risk for the rest of the day. So the other thing I didn't mention was identifying staff skill mix risk. So what risk will there be today? So is there any medical or nursing sick leave or clerical sick leave that will impact our ability to do our normal business? And how will we mitigate that risk today? Are there any building works that are happening today that are actually going to interfere with us being able to use a certain bed space? Other things happening in the hospital? Is the CT getting serviced? What else is going on? Is there a lift getting fixed? Do we have to go some other way to get to ICU? What's happening in other places? The next step, so we had a script that was used, and the next step up was to actually take that information to a hospital-wide meeting where it could matter. And then from there, potentially escalating up higher. So if you have, 3 or 4 children you're very worried about, then the aim would be to make sure there is ICU access, or you can mitigate problems there will be if those children deteriorate and we don't have that. What competing surgical planned work is happening that may need to be cancelled or slowed down because of what else is happening in the organisation. That escalation of that information is key. It's no good if you don't take it somewhere. 2 things happen. One is that the child stays at risk, and the second thing is that the staff lose faith in the process. I gave you this information, I spoke up, I was confident, you did nothing about it. So that's an incredibly important component of it.
That links in really well with Emily T's question on Twitter, which is, Kylie, I'm a rotating officer and every 3 months I'm the newest person on the team. Any tips for speaking up for safety when you're still trying to make your first impressions?
You could ask them, bravely ask them, are they using any situation awareness model or a huddle model? I mean, the fact that greater than 50% of you put your hand up says it's happening. It is spreading. People do believe in it at some level, and irrespective of whether they've seen any evidence. I think for nurses particularly, who are, you will have experienced this, where nurses page you and page you and page you and they keep saying, I'm worried, I'm worried, I'm worried. There's nothing really about that child. But what you do is create a safe forum for that to be spoken up and for there to be respect. So I would ask, how do I identify my concerns? Is this organisation using any huddles? And hopefully you won't offend anybody, but hopefully what you'll do is maybe spark their interest.
Can I add to that, I guess, and it may sound like, and I'm sure Emily does this, like teaching to suck eggs, but we've heard a lot about teamwork and the importance of that in it, and I think that's the hardest thing for people moving from term to term is how do I become part of the team? And I think there's little things that I see junior staff do all the time. It's about learning names, it's about using names, just the little things about, people that bring in, I believe Grace is very good at this, bringing in baked goods. We've heard about cookies.
Yes,
so I've actually seen lots of amazing behaviours from junior staff of ways of integrating themselves into that team so that then they're trusted in that team early. And I think once you've done that, that makes it easier then to escalate those concerns rather than coming in as an unknown and saying, hey, I'm here now, you've only met me for 1 day, but you're not doing this right.
And while the movement of trainees all the time is frustrating for the trainees and often the wards, one of the things we just talked about, changing practice, the best way of changing practice is with people who didn't know how it worked. So maybe the old staff don't want to change, but you're coming in, you don't know that there wasn't a huddle at 9 o'clock in the morning. So start the huddles when the new guys come in, because that will become routine for them.
Susie, did you have any thoughts about, how do you welcome new doctors to your team? How do you get them trained up, especially working in a peripheral hospital? You're working with lots of residents who haven't had any paediatric experience. How do you get them up to speed with what's going on?
So a couple of things. One is, and she's sitting in the front row here, having the importance of having a paediatric fellow. So a senior advanced trainee who's spending the whole 12 months in your unit, they become absolutely fundamental to orientation and welcoming. We do try and individualise things, as in have some knowledge of people's skill mix before they come, and probably one of the most daunting things at working in a unit like ours is neonates, in that if you haven't got a lot of neonatal experience, I think that's one of the things you're very afraid of when you come to a unit like ours, Because every now and then you just get the call that says they're taking a 26-week at a theatre with an abruption, as in there's no chance of getting this baby out in utero, and you are going to be, responsible for resuscitating this baby, hopefully with enough time to rally the troops and help. But if we've identified that, we will do stuff to try and, mitigate the risk. So we'll try and not have them on night shift for the first few weeks, do lots of neonatal resus training. One of the things that we do at our place that works really well is we've got a friendly anaesthetist who's happy to have a paediatric trainee with them on their ENT theatre list on Tuesdays. So our trainees, at least once during the term, get to rotate, spend the morning in theatre practicing airway skills, which I think helps build confidence. But it does mean, I guess you've got to put effort into orientation, both with written info that goes out in advance, but then when they arrive.
Fantastic, thank you. But are there any, can you put your hand up if you want to ask a question from the floor to any of the speakers? There's one. Is there anyone else? Over to you.
I had a question for Kylie. I think we're really trying to get our junior doctors to understand about listening to nurses when they're concerned. Sometimes the argument against that, and it's what we hear, the resistance to the Pews charts, is that everything gets escalated because it's a numerical score. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. So we've got junior doctors on night shifts who've got hundreds of tasks for a tachycardic baby with a fever, and nursing staff who get rated on their ability by audits of whether they've escalated or not. And nursing staff will say, I'm not too worried, but I have to give you a call to do this. Do you have some thoughts on how we can manage that?
That's an enormous answer, because it goes down the line of confidence in nursing and nurses having had enough experience to be able to call it, and the skill mix being right on the shift, etc. But I'm not going to go there. I think that, and most of you will have had experience with the febrile oncology patient who you have to go and review them 7 times in a shift because they're febrile. I think the organisation needs to support finding solutions. So although we have that opportunity to alter calling criteria, people are very frightened to do it for a variety of reasons. And some of that's about it just stays there and nobody will ever review it, and we put a child at greater risk. I think, again, it's about talking and it's about respect. And at some level, you need to override. These are, the huddle is a guide, these aren't mandatory rules, but at some level, in a huddle, for want of a better word, you make a decision about the child that you've been to see, 3 or 4 or 5 times, whatever. But you also appreciate the gut of the clinicians that are involved in this, and the trust and the respect that is sitting there and is, I see as incredibly precious. And I agree, the medical workforce is dragged from pillar to post. They're the second set of eyes after hours. You lose all those resources at 5 o'clock and you become everything to everybody. And you're tired, all of those things are contributing factors. So I think organisationally, you need to work out what you want to do.
So I was going to say, I just think the difficult thing with that is, I think, and the point you make is right, I think what gets lost is what's going on with the child. It becomes, what's the number, what do I need to do to get the number, what do I need to change so that number's okay. But I think the challenge is translating that into a conversation about what do we as a team think is going on with this child, what do we expect to happen over the next few hours, and have that conversation with the parents as well. And so in a little way, that's what I try and do when lots of kids are triggering all the time, is to go, this child's got asthma, I think they're tachycardic because of the Ventolin, this is what I'm going to do about it or not do about it, and try and explain it and be open to questions, but that's challenging.
Yeah, I think there's a gut instinct in nurses that can be reassuring as well, and we can't really, the chart doesn't allow for that to say, to rely on that experience for the nurses.
And thankfully, that broader description where you can include gut feeling and things like that keeps you on the radar, I think has made people more comfortable with that whole thing of a child who's within the flags, but there's still this gut feeling about them, and then they suddenly fall off the perch. So that goes that other way, I think, as well. But it is about those soft systems that we historically relied so heavily on, and as we've got bigger and the way that the organisations work, we don't have that opportunity just to walk up to a peer and ask again and wander around to ICU, whatever. But I think using those systems is important as well.
There's a big problem with accountability. At the crux of that question is someone feeling responsible because a number said something. And we need a system that doesn't always look backwards and gives blame. It looks backwards and learns from why was it one patient was scoring 9 all the time and nothing happened to them and they were fine, and the other patient only scored a 2 but should have been escalated and then came to harm, rather than going, well, you didn't do that. We need much better looking back at things. Any more questions from the floor about any of the studies? I think people are desperate for lunch, aren't they? I get that sense.
I think that's in 10 minutes, but whilst we've got your attention, obviously a lot of people are here because they're interested in keeping up to date. How have each of you individually sort of sought to keep up to date with the wealth of research, and how do you, sort of plan your timing in these kind of things?
So for me, because I'm really interested in patient safety, I look at all of those sites, everything from children's hospitals, Australasia, America, and Cincinnati Kids. A lot of the American children's hospitals actually tweet when something's released that they've been involved in. I follow the SAFE project, which often has updates. I'm a little bit obsessed with children's hospitals, so I follow anything to do with them. And then PIPSQUIG, which is the Paediatric International Patient Safety Network, also will release things on Twitter and Facebook. Yeah, you kind of get used to just seeing those things regularly and knowing sort of what happened yesterday, and they are incredibly good at communicating. There's also a big project at the moment called Solutions for Patient Safety in America, where Stephen Muthing is leading that. I can't remember how many children's hospitals, I think it's a significant number, and they have made one overarching statement, which I love, which is we will not compete on safety. And they've successfully made some incredible landmark achievements around the cost of healthcare and also around safety. And they've picked particular bundles, things like central line infections, etc. But they are sharing in a way that they never have before, and they have absolutely committed to never compete on safety.
I'll mention 2 things. One, I have to put in a plug for the Don't Forget the Bubbles website and Bubble Wrap. The other thing I was going to mention is Mike South's email group of paediatricians, or forum, where you get emails both with clinical questions, but Mike will occasionally post, this latest article or something of interest has been posted. And the clinical questions that get asked, you often learn massive amount from the discussion that goes on as people discuss the difficult case. And I've at different times I've screenshotted people's advice about, melatonin, where to buy it, or what's their regime for prescribing it. So I have learnt that way.
So because Susie stole my answer, I'm going to go left field on this. So I went to a talk once that said if you were to truly be able to keep on top of every study that was published in your field, you'd have no time to actually do anything. And I think it's very few papers that immediately change your practice. So while I agree with everything everyone said, I think you've got to be really selective about where you divert your time and how you use that. And I guess the way I do it is when I'm invited to Don't Forget the Bubbles and asked to present a top 5 papers in Peds Emergency, that was one thing. But the other way is case-based. So when I see a child, making sure that, hey, when was the last time I read around this, and, is our guideline still up to date? And finally, through teaching. So through teaching is the opportunity to update on different topics. But I think while I do scan literature, I find I'm less and less actually reading stuff because it's not immediately relevant to me outside of clinical practice. And I find that challenging.
So taking that on board, can you put your hand up? This isn't a change of practice question. If you've learned something new from this session in the literature that you'd not heard of before.
Oh, good.
Excellent, good, okay. Is anyone
That was
actively
risky,
thinking
Damien.
about changing their practice from something they've heard today in their hospitals? Yeah, that's not bad. Excellent. Cool. Well, I think we should thank all the speakers for the time they've put into doing the data.